A good Sunday afternoon to all of you that are joining me today on our latest edition of our Study in the Gospel account of Mark. And we have entered into a new year. And so Happy New Year to all of you. Hope your 2021 is blessed by the Lord and that you prosper in His will. And I'm grateful to be able to continue this series of lessons. I appreciate the graciousness with which many of you have expressed your gratitude for our study in Mark. I certainly am enjoying the study myself, and hope it continues to be a blessing to you. All right, so we are in chapter 13, and we started that chapter last week by looking at verses 1 through 30. We didn't get that far, but that's the section that we began regarding the fate of the Jerusalem temple. And let's just kind of rehearse a couple of things just to get a foundation in place. If you look at the first two verses of Mark 13, we find Jesus going out of the temple. And one of his disciples said to him, "Teacher, behold what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." And Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left upon another, which will not be torn down." And so we said at the outset that a lot of people use Mark chapter 13 and its parallel accounts in Matthew 24 and Luke 21 to try to teach that there are certain signs that we can observe that will give us an indication of when the Lord is about to return, when the end of the affairs of this life are going to be wrapped up, second coming of Jesus. And I believe it's a misuse of this chapter and those other parallel accounts too. Jesus eventually gets to that topic in this chapter, but not until late. And so these early verses, verses 1 through 30, I believe are all referencing what we were just introduced to in verses 1 and 2, and that is the destruction of the temple and God's judgment on the city of Jerusalem for their rejection of Jesus, their Messiah. And I think we'll see this again in verses 3 and 4. As he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew were questioning him privately. "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when all these things are going to be fulfilled?" Okay, so he has just said, with regard to the temple, it's going to be destroyed. Regardless of how great the buildings are, regardless of the size of the stones, which we looked at some last week, it's all going to be overthrown. And so they want to know, when is this going to happen? Again, what's the topic? What's the subject under discussion? It's the destruction of the temple. Now, while they may have equated the destruction of the temple with the end of the world, Jesus certainly doesn't. And if that was their misunderstanding, which in Matthew's account that seems to be, when they ask what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the world, them seeming to equate the destruction of the temple with the end of time, Jesus corrects them on that. But specifically, they're wanting to know, when's the temple going to be destroyed? And so Jesus answers that in the first part of this chapter, down through verse 30. And we mentioned last time that there are some key terms in this section that will keep us in context and keep us from going off in a direction that the text doesn't really allow us to go. And those terms are these things, which you see in those verses 4, 8, 29, and 30, and the term those days in verses 17, 19, 20, and 24. One of the things that's very helpful in Bible study is recognizing repeated terms. And if we do that, that helps us to keep things in context and helps us to understand what the text is intending to teach. And so if we take note of the times when Jesus refers to these things, well, what are these things? Well, verse 4 is what lays it out for us initially. When will these things be? The overthrowing of the temple. And so Jesus comes back to that terminology, these things, the overthrowing of the temple. And those days, the days in which these things are going to happen. All right, so if we keep those terms in mind and recognize them, it should keep us from misunderstanding what Jesus was talking about. And so that kind of sets up where we are. Now, we went down through verse 13 last time. We're not going to go back through all of that again. But you might just look at, if you have your Bible there handy, and notice in verse 5, Jesus says, be careful, don't let anybody mislead you, because some of the things that he's going to say could be misunderstood as referencing the end of time. But Jesus is being careful and telling them, you be careful, don't let anyone mislead you. If people begin to say, this is the Lord's return, he's telling them, don't believe that. You'll see that in verse 6. Many will come saying, I am he, this is the return, and I'm the Christ. He says, don't believe anybody that claims to be me. And later he will say in verses 21 to 23, if you'll look ahead to that, if anyone says to you, here's the Christ, or he's there, don't believe them. So anyone that claims to be me, don't believe him. Anyone who says, I know where he is, and here he is, and he's returned, he says, don't believe that. All right, so be careful that no one misleads you. Verse 5, he says it again in verse 6. In verse 7, he says you're going to hear about certain things. This is not the end. Don't think it is. It's not. Verse 8, these things are merely the beginning of difficulties, not an indication of the end. Then he talks about persecution that would come to the apostles specifically, being persecuted in the synagogues and before rulers and all of that, verses 9 through 11. There's going to be, the gospel is going to divide families, verse 12, and all of that. So we get down to verse 13, which is where we finished. And so up until all of that, Jesus is saying, look, you're going to hear about all of these things that are happening. Don't be alarmed at all of that. It's certainly not the end of time. It's certainly not my second coming. But those signs are not even an indication of the destruction of the temple. Those things are things that are going to be happening anyway. Those are just things that happen in the world and do not signify any kind of special event that's about to happen. But when you get down to verse 14, Jesus says, now I will tell you, here's what you need to look for. If you want to know when these things, the overthrow of the temple, if you want to know when all those things are about to happen, here's what you need to look for. All right, and that's verse 14. But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be, let the reader understand. I think that's an insertion by Mark. Let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Okay. So now he's given them, here's the sign that you need to be looking for. Don't worry about hearing about wars and rumors of wars. Don't worry about getting news about earthquakes and strange places. But when you see the abomination of desolation, that's when you need to be concerned. All right, well, what is that? What is the abomination of desolation? Well, that's a term that we find 3 times in the book of Daniel. Chapter 9, verse 27, chapter 11, verse 31, chapter 12, verse 11. I believe the first of those references, chapter 9, verse 27, is a specific prophecy of Daniel regarding these events that Jesus is talking about in Mark 13. In other words, the destruction of the temple. And we don't have time to go back and look at all 3 of these prophecies in detail. I'm just telling you, here's what I believe is the case. And so I think Daniel 9:27 is the specific prophecy about Jerusalem's destruction. Chapter 11, verse 31 and chapter 12, verse 11 uses the same language, but I believe those are prophecies that are predicting a different event that happened during what we refer to as the Intertestament period, and a prophecy of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who desecrated the temple. But here's what all three of those things have in common, and why I believe one reason why I believe Jesus used that terminology. First reason I think he used it is because I think Daniel 9:27 is a specific prophecy of the overthrow of Jerusalem in AD 70. The other two events, though they reference specifically a different thing, here's what all three of those references have in common. They refer to either Gentile desecration or destruction of the temple. And so he uses that language to refer to this AD 70 time when Gentiles are going to come into the place where they should not be, in the temple, and they're going to destroy it. Okay, and so Jesus is calling attention back to those prophecies and is saying there's going to come a time when Gentiles are coming upon this place, the temple, Jerusalem, and when that happens, then you need to be concerned and you need to start taking evasive action. And I think if we look at Luke's account of this same conversation, Luke records Jesus as referencing at that time this: when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is near. All right, now again, this is Luke's account of this same conversation. So you put those two things together, the abomination of desolation is the surrounding of Jerusalem by Gentile armies. And so Jesus says, when you see that happen, now it's time to get out of town. Again, back to verse 14. Then, when you see the abomination of desolation, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Okay, now's the time to move. There's no reason to get out and run for your lives when you hear some reference to, hey, there was an earthquake in some strange place, or hey, there's a battle going on over in this other part of the world. You're going to hear about wars and rumors of wars. No reason to do anything then. You're going to hear about earthquakes. No reason to get up in arms about that. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, what Daniel predicted as the abomination of desolation, then get out. All right? Because now you know the desolation is near. Okay? And so you've got then the reference there, flee to the mountains, verse 14. Now let's pick it up where he continues. Here's what you need to do. The one who's on the housetop must not go down or go in to get anything out of his house. And the one who's in the field must not turn back to get his coat. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that it may not happen in winter. Okay? So Jesus is saying, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, flee to the mountains. Don't even take time to go back and get your stuff. Just get out. And he says, and pray that, that you're not pregnant or nursing at that time, or that it's not in winter. Why would that be a problem? Well, it makes travel more difficult. It makes it harder. Those of you that have had experience with pregnancy and young children, it's a hassle to go anywhere. But especially if you're leaving your home to save your lives, it's just going to be harder. And so pray that that's not the case for you. And so the idea is urgency. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, there's an urgency. You've got to get out to save your lives. They're about to take down this place. Okay? Now, again, reference in verse 17, those days. Okay, so we're still talking about the days in which these things, the overthrow of the temple, are going to happen. This is not referencing the end of time. Because, think about this, when he says in verse 17, be sure, pray that you're not with child or not nursing. Pray that it's not in winter. Flee to the mountains. Now, here's my question. What significance would any of that have for the second coming? Think about it. If he's referencing the second coming, what good is it going to do for somebody to flee to the mountains? Is the second coming not going to affect people that are in mountains? What difference does it make if it's winter, spring, summer, or fall? What difference will it make if somebody's pregnant or nursing? None of those things are going to have any significance or any effect on the things that are going to happen when Jesus returns at the end of time. But if he's talking about a temporal judgment on the temple and on that city, something that could be avoided by leaving town, then all of that makes perfect sense. And so 17 and 18 is another good reason to conclude that he's talking still about these things and those days, the destruction of the temple and the city. All right, so let's continue. Verse 19, for those days, okay, still talking about the same thing. For those days will be a time of tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the creation which God created until now, and never will. Now that's a bold statement. Jesus is saying that the things that would happen to Jerusalem and the temple and the people in the city would be a unique event in all of history. And I believe he's obviously telling the truth. This was a terribly devastating event, probably the likes of which we don't fully understand. And I want to share with you a summary of some of the things that happened in that 70 AD siege and destruction of the city of Jerusalem. This comes from Wayne Jackson, the late Wayne Jackson, in his New Testament commentary. He has a 1-volume commentary on the entire New Testament that I think is very helpful. If you don't have a copy of that, you should get one. And he summarizes, Brother Jackson does, the information that comes to us primarily from Josephus. Flavius Josephus was a Jewish man who lived at the time of Christ, was born in the latter part of the 1st century BC and lived into the middle or late actually of the 1st century AD. If I remember, I know he lived in the 1st century. His birth year, don't quote me on that. I'd have to go back and look at that. But he lived in the 1st century AD and died late in the 1st century AD. And so he recorded, Josephus was employed by the Romans. Oddly enough, the Romans contracted him to write a history of the Jewish people. Josephus did that, and so we have that recorded. Uninspired, of course, but there is historical value to it. And so reading from the writings of Josephus, Brother Jackson kind of summarizes a lot of what Josephus wrote about this AD 70 event. Now, Josephus is writing after the fact and made several descriptive claims. So what I'm reading to you is the words of Brother Jackson from his commentary. The carnage of the Jerusalem siege, which lasted for months, was horrible beyond belief. When the Romans finally broke into the city, the sight of so many corpses shocked even hardened soldiers. The slaughter of the city's citizens was so terrible that fires were extinguished by the profusion of blood, that coming from Josephus. Josephus records that 1.1 million Jews were killed in Jerusalem, and some 97,000 others were taken as slaves into captivity. It has been estimated that some 1.3 million plus Jews in Jerusalem and in the regions in proximity to Judea died by famine, the sword, burning, and crucifixion. Again, from Josephus's work. Some scholars believe that even these figures are too conservative. In fact, Josephus himself expressed the view that the suffering of this catastrophe exceeded anything known to man previously. Never since that time has a city suffered such ravishment with the utter extermination of its population. Now, if you want to go and read in Josephus's work, The Wars of the Jews, you can read more about how this man described the devastation that came upon the city. He described it as a unique occurrence in history, and Jesus described it that same way. Now, certainly others have suffered. The Jewish people have suffered. Some people have called attention to this and said, well, the Holocaust was worse than this. Well, it certainly was in terms of numbers. There's no question about that. But this was a unique historical event in a couple of ways. One, all of this happened on one city. The Holocaust, and I'm not trying to minimize that at all, but it involved certainly a broader area, geographical area. This was something located in one particular place. And the second thing, and I think more importantly, that makes this a unique event, is that this judgment and the carnage that happened because of it was a specific judgment against the Jewish people for their rejection of their Messiah. So this was their punishment for that rejection. And Jesus was clear about that, as we'll notice in just a moment in a couple of other references. And so I believe that too makes this a unique event in history because of not just the terrible suffering that happened, but also the reason for it. That this was a specific judgment against God's chosen people because they rejected his son. And so that does make it unique in history. All right, so let's move on. Verse number 20. Now, so right after he talks about the carnage, he says, but unless the Lord had shortened those days, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect whom he chose, he shortened the days. All right, so even in his judgment, God was still merciful. He did not allow them to be totally exterminated. And had God not been merciful to them in his providence, then it could have been that bad. As bad as it was, it certainly could have been worse than it was. And so even then, God was merciful. All right, 21. Pardon me. And then, if anyone says to you, behold, here is the Christ, or behold, he is there, do not believe him. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and will show signs and wonders in order to lead astray, if possible, the elect. But take heed, behold, I have told you everything in advance. All right, so again, it's another of those warnings like he issued earlier. Don't believe anybody that says that these events are the end, are the Lord's final return, and that he has come back. Jesus says, don't believe him, because that's not going to be the case. They're going to try to mislead the elect, those that I've chosen, which I believe are reference to Christians. They'll try to mislead, but you shouldn't be misled, because he said, I've told you this in advance. All right? I've already told you, don't be deceived by that. So you really have no excuse. You shouldn't believe people that will come saying, the Lord has returned and all of that, because I've already warned you that that's not what's happening. All right. Now, before we look at verse 24, I want you to look in your copy of the Bible. There are those that publish Bibles try to be helpful in distinguishing different subject matters. In other words, some Bibles, not all of them do, so yours may not, but a lot of Bibles have topic headings, so that as you're reading through and you come to a certain place, they may have a division point there where they put in a subject heading, like here's the subject of this next section. All right. Now, in the copy of the Bible that I'm particularly using and reading from, it's New American Standard Version. There's, after verse 23 and before verse 24, there's a topical insertion there that says the return of Christ. We have to remember that those topical headings are not inspired. Those topical headings did not exist in the original manuscripts of the biblical text. Those are things that have been inserted by those who created the translation, again, with pure motives. They're trying to be helpful, to help the reader understand, all right, here's a topic change, here's where something different is going to be spoken about. And sometimes they're right, at other times they are wrong. I believe they are wrong in inserting that topical heading right here. I don't believe the return of Christ is under discussion yet. And here are the reasons why I believe that topic insertion is bad. It's not helpful. It's misleading. Okay, look at verse 24. But in those days, now, haven't we been talking about that being a key phrase? These things in those days. All right, so we're still talking about the same period of time. Still talking about the destruction of the temple. Still talking about the downfall of the city, not the end of time. Okay? But in those days, after that tribulation, now I want to stop there too. After that tribulation, well, I try to be careful whenever I call into question certain translations, because I am a very, very far distance from being a scholar of the Greek language. I know how to use certain helps and lexicons and things of that sort. Okay, but I am not a Greek scholar. And so I always have some hesitation when I come across something and I am about to say, this is a poor translation. But that word that's translated in the New American Standard, after that tribulation, one of the things about Greek prepositions is that there is sometimes some elasticity in their usage. In other words, they can be translated into English different ways. And context is a major factor in determining how is this preposition best translated. Well, that Greek preposition is the word meta. And it certainly can be accurately translated after. But that's not the only possibility with that word. The lexicons tell us that it can also be translated with, which is certainly a different concept than after, as far as timing is concerned. I believe, given the contextual considerations, that word would be better translated with instead of after, for these reasons. Again, it's a contextual thing. Grammatically, by definition, it could be either of those, and then even some additional English equivalents. But given the considerations of context, I think with is better there than after, for these reasons. First of all, you still have that indication in those days. We're still talking about the same days that he's been talking about. There is also the consideration that we'll get to later, but you just go ahead and jump down there and look at it, and that's verse 30. Verse 30, Jesus says, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place." Okay? Verse 30 is a key timing marker where Jesus says, all right, everything that I have told you up to this point will take place in this generation. Now, when you get past verse 30, you're not confined by that time marker. But up until then, Jesus says, these things are going to happen in this generation. These things, destruction of the temple, those days that I've been talking about where these things are going to happen in this generation. All right? So with that in mind, contextually, I think with that tribulation is better than after. I think after confuses the reader because it makes it sound like he's making a transition to the end of time. I don't believe he is, and I think I can show why that is a more than reasonable understanding of this section. All right, so let's look at it. But in those days, with that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers that are in the heavens will be shaken. Now, our first thought regarding that is, well, that sure sounds like end of time to me. That sure sounds like end of the world to me. Well, I'll grant that that language sounds very much like the fact that the sun and the moon and the heavenly bodies and all of that are going to be destroyed. But the question needs to be, since we have all of these contextual considerations, especially verse 30 that says, all of the things that I've just talked about will happen in this generation, the generation that he was talking to. With that being there, that clear passage, is it possible that this other passage, verses 24 and following, could fit into that time frame? And the answer to that is yes. It's not a difficult thing to recognize that kind of language, the sun not giving its light, the moon not giving its light, the stars falling from the heavens, all of that apocalyptic, figurative language was used all over the Old Testament when prophets would predict the downfall of nations, the downfall of cities, a temporal judgment against cities and nations. Okay? And so this language that Jesus is using here, for those that would have been familiar with Old Testament apocalyptic language, would recognize this is exactly the way God would describe prophetically, apocalyptically, figuratively, the downfall of nations within the process of time, not the end of time. Okay? I'll give you some examples. Isaiah chapter 13. Verses 9 and 10. This is a reference to Babylon. If you go back and look at the earlier verses in Isaiah 13, you'll see that the prophet is addressing the future of Babylon. Behold, the day of the Lord is coming, cruel with fury and burning anger, to make the land a desolation, and he will exterminate its sinners from it. For the stars of heaven and their constellations will not flash forth their light. The sun will be dark when it rises, and the moon will not shed its light. All right? Very similar language to what Jesus is using in Mark 13. But that passage in Isaiah is talking about the overthrow, the destruction of the empire of the Babylonians, not at the end of time, but within the process of time. Here's another, Ezekiel 32, verses 7 and 8. This is a prophecy against Egypt. And he says, "And when I extinguish you, Egypt, I will cover the heavens and darken their stars. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon will not give its light. All the shining lights in the heavens I will darken over you, and will set darkness on your land, declares the Lord God." Again, you go back and look at that in context, and you'll see Ezekiel is addressing Egypt and a coming destruction of it, a coming judgment against that nation by God in the process of time, not at the end of time. And then one more right quickly from Joel chapter 3, verse 15. "The sun and moon grow dark, and the stars lose their brightness." You go back and look again at the context of that passage in Joel, and you'll see that this is the prophet speaking against the nation of Philistia, the cities of Tyre and Sidon, and the region of the Philistines. But he uses the language of the apocalyptic figurative language of the darkening of the skies, the darkening of the heavenly bodies, the falling of them from the skies. All of those things are, again, apocalyptic figurative references to the downfall of cities and nations. Well, what is Jesus predicting in Matthew 13? The downfall of a city and a nation. The city of Jerusalem, the nation of, or the region of Judea, when the Romans come and destroy the place. But that type of figurative language of the moon being darkened and the stars falling and all of that, it's figurative language just to impress upon people the utter devastation, the coming down of their world. It's a figurative use of language, all right? So Jesus continues, "Then they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send forth the angels and will gather together his elect from the four winds, from the farthest end of the earth to the farthest end of heaven." Well, again, perhaps our initial thought regarding that is, that has to be the end of time. You'll see the Son of Man coming in the clouds. That's second coming terminology. Well, if Jesus were speaking literally, then you would be forced to conclude that. But could he be speaking of a figurative, apocalyptic coming in which he's not literally coming, but he's coming in judgment? A figurative use. Well, again, you've got Old Testament language that sounds eerily familiar to the language Jesus is using here in Matthew 13. All right, look at Isaiah chapter 19, verse 1. "The oracle concerning Egypt. Behold, the Lord is riding on a swift cloud and is about to come to Egypt. The idols of Egypt will tremble at his presence, and the heart of the Egyptians will melt within them." Well, did God literally, physically appear in Egypt? No, he didn't. Was he literally coming on a cloud? No. It was figurative language, again, to express God's judgment against that nation. He was coming to them in judgment. All right? But that concept is expressed in figurative terms that make it look like or sound like that God would physically come on a cloud to visit them for the purposes of destruction. Well, it wasn't intended to be understood literally. All right? It's figurative language, apocalyptic language, referencing the downfall of nations. Again, what's Jesus talking about? Is he coming to judge his people? Is he coming to judge the city of Jerusalem and overthrow its temple? Yes, by means of the Romans. But it is God's judgment coming upon them. And that's the language, the apocalyptic language that he uses to express that concept. Now, again, it has to be that way, in my mind, because of the bookend statement of verse 30. Whatever he's talking about in verses 24 through 29 It has to be in that generation. These things, those days. He doesn't make a transition to a different topic until you get to verse 31. All right, so we're still talking about these things in those days. And it's not a stretch for this language to be used that way. It's all over the Old Testament. He's just using the language, the apocalyptic language, that many of the prophets before him used to describe very similar judgments against people. All right? And then verse 27, incidentally, about sending forth and gathering the elect together, that's the language of protection. So the point is that while the Jewish people are being punished with the coming of the Romans, the elect, regardless of where they're scattered, are being protected. Okay, the gathering together is, again, not literal. It's the language of protection. Do you remember in Matthew 23, when Jesus looked out over Jerusalem, he said, remember, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you that kill the prophets and stone those that are sent to you, how often would I have what? Gathered your people together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wing. What is that? It's the language of protection. Was Jesus saying specifically and literally, I wanted to bring every Jewish person from all over the world into one physical location? No, he's using the language to say, just like a hen gathers her chicks under her wings to protect them, how often would I have done that? I would have protected you if you had been willing to accept God's rule and authority in your life. But you weren't. Okay, but you would not. And then Jesus says, Matthew 23:38, right after that statement, I would have gathered you together, would have protected you, but you wouldn't let me. Behold, your house is left unto you desolate. Your house, the temple. Your temple is desolate. Why? It's going to be destroyed. Why? Because you didn't come to me, and therefore you don't have the protection. You're not going to be protected. You're going to be destroyed. So the language of Mark 13:27 is the language of protection. The elect, God's people, Christians, are not going to be the target of this destruction that comes on Jerusalem in 70. That's going to be directed toward those that rejected Jesus as the Messiah, not those who accepted him. All right? So verse 27 is the language of protection, regardless of where the elect are. From the four winds of heaven. The punishment's not going to be directed at them. It'll be directed toward my people. All right? Now, we're going to finish this up. Hang with me. You can watch this on double speed. Now, look at 28. Now learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. Now, the fig tree. Remember that? Chapter 11, verses 12 through 14. Jesus is from the Mount of Olives. He's looking out toward Jerusalem, and there's this fig tree there. And how we talked about how, it had leaves. It showed the promise of fruit, but there was no fruit. When they got there, there was no fruit. And so Jesus cursed it. And we talked then, when we studied that as Jesus is looking at the temple, right there in that same view that he had from the Mount of Olives, he sees activity in the temple. Priests are busy. There's money changers. People are all over the place. It showed the promise of bearing fruit, but the reality was they were not bearing fruit for God. And so Jesus cursed the fig tree, I believe, as a symbolic reference to the fact that God's people were going to be cursed themselves. Jerusalem, the temple area that showed the promise of fruit, it looked like it externally, but there was no fruit being born for God. And so the cursing of the fig tree was the foreshadowing of this event that Jesus says was going to happen. And so he says, learn the lesson of the fig tree. This is what I intended for you to learn when I cursed the fig tree. It shows the promise of fruit, but there's no fruit there. and I cursed it. And so, just like with the activity, the fruitless activity in Jerusalem, Jesus says it's like that fig tree. Its end is near, the end of this system that is not bearing fruit. Now, what this is, this protection of God's people, the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple, that's the fulfillment of the parable of the tenants back in chapter 12, verses 9 through 11. Remember, the tenants were put in charge of the vineyard. The owner kept sending people to check on it, the prophets. They kept mistreating them. Finally, the owner says, I'll send my son. And when the son came, the tenants who were in charge of the vineyard said, if we kill the son, then the vineyard will be ours. Remember that? The Jewish leadership were the tenants. They had been put in charge of God's people, but they weren't taking care of God's people. And God kept sending prophets. They kept mistreating the prophets. Then finally God sends his son. Now, the mindset of the religious leadership is, if we kill him, the vineyard will be ours. If we kill the son, we will maintain our control of the vineyard of God's people. We will not lose the authority that we've taken upon ourselves. But remember, they forgot about the owner. And in the parable, Jesus says, what will the owner do? He'll destroy those tenants, and he'll give the vineyard to someone else. That's what this section in Mark 13 is predicting. The destruction of Jerusalem, the overthrow of the temple, is God's act of destroying the tenants and giving the vineyard to someone else, his elect, Christians. All right? So the leaders had seized power and control for themselves. They didn't care about the owner or his son, and they didn't want to give up that power and authority and control. God was going to take it back in that act. All right? So this is greatness. This is pulling all of that together. All right, let's finish up. Here we go. Even so, you too, when you see these things happening, recognize that he's near, right at the door, right? The judgment is coming. And then 30, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Okay? This generation. Now, that phrase, generation, is used 4 times in Mark. It's used in chapter 8, verse 12, chapter 8, verse 38, chapter 9, verse 19, and in this passage, Mark 13, verse 20. And in each case, that word, generation, is used to refer to the people that were living at that time. This generation is not going to pass until all of these things that I've just described to you take place. And in less than 40 years from that time, they did. Jerusalem fell in AD 70. All right, now the last section. Now he's going to transition to talk about the second coming. Okay? Beginning in verse 31, we're no longer bound by that bookend of this generation. Okay? So he says in 31 and 32, heaven and earth will pass away. My words will not pass away. But of that day or hour no one knows. Not even the angels in heaven nor the Son, but the Father alone. Okay? Jesus goes from talking about those days to that day. All right? You see the difference in the language? He says, look, heaven and earth are going to pass away. There will be an end. Okay? I will ultimately return and bring an end to everything. Heaven and earth will pass away. All right? But verse 31 or 32, of that day and hour, when heaven and earth pass away, of that day and hour, nobody knows. Not the angels. I don't even know, Jesus said, but the Father alone. Now think about that. Jesus knew when Jerusalem would fall. He knew when these things would take place because he told them, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, get out. The desolation is near. verse 14. So while he knew when Jerusalem was going to fall, here was a day he didn't know. Now, it's my opinion that I believe he does now in his, as he's returned back to the Father and all that, but that's just a matter of opinion. At the very least, he comes out and says, right now, at that moment, when he was in the flesh on the earth, he didn't know. And anybody who thinks that they do know, Jesus said, is a deceiver. Remember, if they say he's here when all these other things are happening, don't believe them. Because that's not when it is, and they don't know when it is. Nobody but the Father knows when it is. Okay? So then, the final section, verses 33 to 37, is an emphasis on being alert. Okay? And like we talked about earlier, the importance of recognizing repeated words and phrases, you have that in this section. You have the phrase, be alert, in verse 33, verse 34, verse 35, and verse 37. 4 times in these verses, be alert. And you have the phrase, you do not know, twice, in verse 33 and in verse 35. That's the emphasis, that's the point to get from verses 33 to 37. You don't know when I'm going to return for that final time. So therefore, stay alert. All right, so let's look at that in 33 to 37. Take heed, keep on the alert, for you do not know when the appointed time will come. It's like a man away on a journey, who upon leaving his house and putting his slaves in charge, assigning to each one his task, also commanded the doorkeeper to stay on the alert. Therefore, be on the alert, for you do not know when the master of the house is coming, whether in the evening, at midnight, or when the rooster crows, or in the morning, in case he should come suddenly and find you asleep. What I say to you, I say to all, be on the alert. All right, not much more to add to that. You don't know, nobody knows when I'm going to return and heaven and earth does pass away. Nobody knows when that's going to be. So you just be alert all the time, and then you'll be ready whenever it happens. All right, so that's chapter 13. I know we've gone longer than we normally do, but I wanted to finish all of that in this section so we didn't break it up any farther. But I won't take up any more of your time. Thank you for being patient and listening to this class that was longer than the others. And we'll pick up here with chapter 14 beginning next time. Thanks a bunch. Love you.